In the summer of 1889, May-dway-gwa-no-nind, or He Who Is Spoken To, defended his homeland and his people during the negotiations for the Nelson Act. He attended the open council sessions in Red Lake, maintaining his position against allotment and keeping nearly all of Upper and Lower Red Lake out of the U.S. government's hands. Minnesota became a state in 1858, only 3 decades before the Nelson Act was signed. However, much of Minnesota's land was already occupied by a vast amount of people whose cultures were rooted deeply in their homes. Specifically, the Red Lake Ojibwe in northern Minnesota greatly cared for their home, especially their lake. The government also saw value in Red Lake land. As soon as 1863, the U.S. government took the Red River Valley when the Old Crossing Treaty was signed by Red Lake chiefs, ceding 11 million acres of land, which forced many Ojibwe people to abandon their homes to make way for white settlers. The treaty era ended in 1871. From that point on, the government could only use congressional acts to retrieve land from Native people. From this idea sprang the General Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act. Henry L. Dawes set up a policy of allotment through the Dawes Act, which was meant to divide tribal lands into allotments for individual Indians.
He Who Is Spoken To realized that there were many things that defined a nation and a people. One of those was having a land. Some of what makes Red Lake really distinctive today and has maintained a lot of the sovereignty that Red Lake has today were things that He Who Is Spoken To had to fight for during his lifetime. Red Lake was never allotted, so instead of taking the reservation and chopping it up into parcels and each family having their own separate parcel of land, he said, we will never accept allotment here. We will all own this land collectively as a people.
Many Ojibwe communities in Minnesota agreed to allotment, but Red Lake leaders were vigilant. There was already a sense of mistrust between the Red Lake chiefs and the U.S. government, due to unkept promises from the Old Crossing Treaty in 1863. When the chiefs were presented with the Dawes Act, they refused to accept it. Little did they know there was a big effort to continue the push for Red Lake land. Knute Nelson, a congressman, was devising a new legislation that would further government control over Red Lake lands. This legislation would come to be known as the Nelson Act. The Nelson Act was approved on January 14, 1889. The U.S. Chippewa Commission was fully formed within months, and in early summer they set out to acquire signatures from the Ojibwe communities of Minnesota. The U.S. Chippewa Commission didn't have the authority to alter the act itself. The terms of the Nelson Act were as follows: a land cession close to 3 million acres of land from Red Lake, relocations of many Native communities, and application of allotment to Indian land all across Minnesota. He Who Is Spoken To could not agree to the terms without negotiations and alterations. Despite not having the power to do so, the U.S. Chippewa Commission agreed to negotiate with Red Lake chiefs. The U.S. Chippewa Commission knew it would be quite difficult to get Red Lake to consent to the Nelson Act. So, there were 7 open council meetings held in Red Lake from June 29th to July 6th in 1889. He Who Is Spoken To stood at the front lines, pressuring Henry Rice about important issues.
At White Earth, Indians own 9% of their own reservation. At Leech Lake, Indians own 4% of their own reservation. And on most of those 2 reservations, Native people are minorities in their own space. That did not happen at Red Lake. And the reason that did not happen at Red Lake was He Who Was Spoken To, who successfully dodged the allotment pressure.
Red Lake chiefs were not content to accept allotment, nor were they pleased to hand over the lake. It was difficult for He Who Was Spoken To trust the promises from the United States government. It hadn't worked out well in the past. One noteworthy demand of He Who Was Spoken To and past chiefs was the prohibition of selling and consuming alcohol in Red Lake. He Who Was Spoken To and the other chiefs agreed that alcohol was harmful and should not be allowed in Red Lake. More importantly, He Who Was Spoken To viciously opposed allotment. Red Lake never consented to the General Allotment Act, and they would not change their minds for the Nelson Act. He who was spoken to understood that it would divide not only Red Lake land, but also the Red Lake people. He worked his whole life to do the opposite. He united the Ojibwe villages in Red Lake into one nation. Allotment went against everything he stood for. Another important idea that was stressed in these council meetings was keeping the lake in the Red Lake Ojibwe's possession. He who was spoken to sought to keep all of Upper and Lower Red Lake, and all land at least a mile out from its shore. He who was spoken to would often refer to future generations when discussing the Nelson Act. This property under discussion called Red Lake is my property. These persons whom you see before you are my children. They own this place the same as I own it. My friends, I ask that we reserve the whole of the lake as ours and our grandchildren hereafter.
He didn't think simply in terms of what's best for me or for my children. He was really concerned about all of the Ojibwe people across the region, and he was trying to orchestrate political outcomes against really difficult odds that would look out for everyone. And both his political statements and his actions really support the understanding that he was trying to keep the lake and the land in Red Lake hands so that they would have access to the resources, physical and spiritual home, and identity as a people.
As it became clear that the Red Lake Ojibwe wouldn't give up their stand against allotment, the commissioners finally conceded. The Chippewa Commission agreed to postpone further allotment negotiations until a later date, and agreed to a map that he who was spoken to drew himself. Henry Rice, the main spokesman of the U.S. Chippewa Commission, swore to keep his word in the Ojibwe way, and then signed the document to promise the way a government official would. This act of faith on Rice is what helped the Red Lake Chiefs finally agree to the Nelson Act on July 6, 1889. The effects were nearly immediate. Almost 3 million acres of Red Lake land had been ceded, and at the time, the Ojibwe people struggled. Many were forced to move closer to Red Lake or to other reservations, such as White Earth. However, the lake had been spared. After everything, they still had a home. He who was spoken to was a big part of that. The efforts from he who was spoken to and the other Red Lake chiefs was a spark of resistance and resilience amidst a swarm of obstacles. He who was spoken to's time as a Red Lake chief created a strong foundation for Red Lake leaders to come. Leaders such as Peter Graves and Roger Jourdain helped to take the necessary steps. In 1918, almost a century ago, Peter Graves reformed Red Lake's political system by creating a tribal council and writing a constitution. In 1953, Roger Jourdain faced the termination policy head-on and did a lot to improve the quality of life in Red Lake. Moreover, the government would not stop pushing allotment until 1983. Despite their many attempts, Red Lake never consented to the allotment policy. They would also never accept alcohol in Red Lake. To this day, the selling and possession of alcohol are still illegal. As recently as 2015, Red Lakers held a referendum vote to decide whether or not to sell alcohol at their casinos. The majority voted no. All of these events trace back to he who was spoken to and the other great leaders that Red Lake had in the past. Had it not been for them, Red Lake Nation wouldn't be as strong as it is today. 128 years ago, he who was spoken to took a stand for Red Lake and its future generations by protecting Red Lake land, water, and the people. He was firm, yet diplomatic. Because of his actions, Red Lake is still a strong nation today. The fierceness, determination, and intellect that he who was spoken to possessed was one of the most vital reasons as to why Red Lake was able to stand their ground against allotment, alcohol, and the taking of the lake. All of these values were protected for the sake of future generations, and the people of Red Lake remain resolute in these ideals even today.
They just don't understand. There ain't no other land like the motherland. Yeah, I come from Red Lake. They just don't understand. There ain't no other land like the motherland. Yeah, I come from Red Lake. What's the resi rep? What's the tribe you from? What's the nation? Let them know. Red Lake. What's the resi rep? What's the tribe you from? What's the nation? Let them know. Red Lake. Red Lake. Red Lake. Red Lake, what's the resi rep? Red Lake.